Praise the Lord, everyone. Shaun back with another video for you all. Um, I wanted to do this video. Yet again, I'm revisiting the topic of not being able to lose salvation and looking at verses where people believe that a verse indicates that a person can lose their salvation. So, I wanted to look at Matthew 18. And in this chapter, Jesus Christ gives this parable um, addressing people showing unforgiveness. And it's found in Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. And I'm on BibleHub.com, as you can see. And I like BibleHub because you can see these little subtitles that kind of break down each part of the chapter. And I think that's really a good thing to kind of have a overview even throughout the chapter to kind of see what's being talked about. So in Matthew 18, in this parable, Jesus is describing this incident where a man or a servant owed his master like 10,000 talents, and the master was going to sell his family off, and do all these things in order for him to get what he was owed. And the servant, he was very sorrowful, and he was saying how, just please just allow me the opportunity, have patience with me for me to be able to pay you back. So the master felt compassion for the servant, and I believe he saw how I guess sincere he was. So he forgave this servant. Now, this same servant who experienced grace and forgiveness from his master, this same servant has someone who owed him money, a fellow servant. And this fellow servant owed him 100 pence. The verse says, if you read, and it said, he grabbed him by the throat, and, he put the guy in prison, even though the guy had the same sorrowful manner. He wanted him to have patience with him and to forgive him, but he didn't want to hear it when he was on the other end of it, and he threw the guy in prison. So then the other fellow servants heard or somehow found out what was going on, went back to their master, told their master what this particular servant had did. And the master was very upset. He said, you threw this guy in prison over a debt he owed, but you owed me money as well. You were in debt to me, and I forgave you. Yet you're going to not show him grace, not show him mercy after I showed you mercy. And I believe there's significance in this parable with the fact that the first servant owed his master exponentially more than the other fellow servant owed him. This servant owed his master 10,000 talents, while this other guy owed him 100 pence. So, it was obviously way more. Yet, the master felt compassion. But this other guy, he didn't share that same compassion he was given. So what ended up happening is that servant ended up being thrown in prison to the tormentors by the master for not showing the same grace that he was given, the same forgiveness he was given. So Jesus concludes and he says, this is what's going to happen, by my Father if you all behave in the same way. So, essentially, people will see this verse and they'll equate it to, well, you see, that fellow servant, he didn't show forgiveness, and then he was turned over to the tormentors. And so, we think of tormentors and we think people being tormented in hell. And, I'll admit, on the surface, I can kind of see where they make the connection, where it seems like, okay, well, you're going to lose salvation, you're going to be thrown in hell. But we have to make sure we get the context. We have to make sure what's going on. And I always like to say, we have to establish our points, and we have to make sure that these, we know nothing contradicts. So if something seems to conflict, then it's not the Bible that's actually conflicting, it's our understanding that needs to be corrected. So 1 Peter 1:23 through 25, it talks about how we're born again, not of a corruptible seed, but of an incorruptible seed. It said, which abideth and liveth forever. So we have that seed in us. We have the Holy Spirit. We have salvation that is incorruptible. So if we're born again of something that's incorruptible, then that's just what it is. It can't be corrupted. So, what are we to do with this? As far as what First Peter says, and then with a verse or a parable that Jesus gave, where it ends up where this guy was given over to tormentors. Well, if we go all the way up to Matthew 18 and we look at the first verse, we can see this little subtitle. It says the greatest in the kingdom. So as we read in the first verse, his disciples asked Jesus a question. It says, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So the rest of this chapter is Jesus responding to that question. Now, if we look, we see that he pulls aside a little child, and he basically says, unless you become like one of these little children, you shall no way enter into the kingdom. So we're supposed to be, humble like a child. We're supposed to have a childlike faith in a sense. So then Jesus begins to describe um, some other like scenarios or situations and the type of characteristics that a person should display in these scenarios. So here Jesus talks about if a person is sinned against. Well, I'm sorry, I kind of jumped ahead. I'm sorry. He talks about if something offends you, it's better to kind of cut that part of your life out, or to not have that thing be the reason why you don't come to Christ, essentially. And he makes a comparison on basically getting rid of the part of your body. If your eye offends thee, pluck it out. If your hand offends thee, cut it off. Your foot offends thee, cut it off. Or it's better to enter into the kingdom basically maimed than it is to have your full body thrown into hell. Now, this is not pertaining to work salvation. This is pertaining to if you have something that you're going to put above, accepting Christ for who he is and what he did for you for your sins, then you have to get rid of that. So, just like, for instance, the rich man. When the rich man said that he followed all the laws from a youth, he said, what else do I lack? Christ said, well, sell all your possessions and you'll have riches in heaven. And it says that the man went off sad because he had great possessions. So Christ said, it's hardly someone rich will enter the kingdom of heaven. He said, and then he says how this man put his trust in his possessions. So it's all about what you put your trust in. So if you're a person that put your trust in wealth, your trust in thinking you can be good enough, in your attempts to follow the law, whatever it is that's going to keep you from coming to that saving knowledge, that saving faith of believing who Christ is and what he did for you, then you need to cut that off, get rid of it. So he goes from that, and then he starts to talk about a sheep going astray. And he basically, he lets us know. And this honestly speaks to not being able to lose salvation, because he talks about, if a man or a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of those goes astray, he says that he is more happy that he found that one that went astray more than the 99. Now, this is not to say that the 99 he doesn't care about, but they didn't go astray. But that one went astray, and he wants us all in one accord. So he wants us all to have fellowship in him. So if one goes astray, well, if you get that one back into the fold, then that is a great thing. So if you look at verse 14, it says, "Even so, if it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish, even so it is not the will. I'm sorry, it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." So here, verse 14 clearly says how the will of the Father is that not one of these little ones should perish. One of these little sheep. So God is going to keep every one of us. It says God gives us to his son, and he loseth not one. So that just shows you, it's not like to say he loses a few or some. He says not even one. That means he's going to have 100% track record on keeping all those saved, keeping those people saved. So then it goes to where it talks about if someone sins against you. And then Jesus describes going to that person, talking to him. If that person doesn't hear you, bringing another person or two people with you, they still don't hear you, then to bring them before the church. Hopefully that person will hear. But then, if they don't, still, even in front of the church or with the church trying to reason with the person, they still don't hear. He says treat them like a publican and a heathen. Basically you kind of disassociate yourself. If this is the mindset or the material, or I'm sorry, the mindset or the manner in which they're going to kind of be. Not this is not to say that they necessarily lost their salvation, but you don't want a person to become a stumbling block for you in your walk, in your spiritual maturity, essentially. So from this, Jesus Christ continues, and then he gets into this parable in question about the unforgiving servant. Now, in the beginning, I said how people like to equate this the end of the parable about the unforgiving servant being given over to the tormentors, and that equating that to hell. Now, like I said before, I can kind of see where they can kind of make that connection, but certain times there are more discernment and more context really has to be kind of looked at to be able to kind of get what's here. So in the beginning of the chapter, we looked at the disciples asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, why do I bring that up? Well, as it pertains to this unforgiving servant being given over to the tormentors, well, Jesus is responding to this question: who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? There are no tormentors in heaven. People are tormented, in hell and in the lake of fire eventually. No one is tormented, in heaven. So the torment that I believe in which Jesus was referring to is that as believers are obedient to God's instructions, and for this particular instruction of forgiving others as we have been forgiven, as Christ also says somewhere else, essentially, God is going to, honor that, and, his in your day-to-day life. Not to say that your life is going to be a walk in the park, a bowl of cherries, but a lot of things you'll be able to avoid, and God will just, shed his grace more and more on you because he is seeing you doing what he wants you to do, giving grace to others the same way he gave grace to you. But if you're going to be out here and have the audacity to hold a grudge against someone when God has all the reasons in the world to hold a grudge against you, us, everyone, then, he's going to say, okay, well, I forgave you, but you don't want to forgive that person. Okay. And God will kind of remove his hand of grace, if you will. So, we've actually seen in the Old Testament where Israel, they will go back and forth being in God's good graces and God removing his grace. Different times when God was for Israel, you will see them winning battles, triumphing in situations that they think they couldn't get through. But then when they started to mess up and they kept messing up, you will see about how God removed or turned his face from them or removed his hand from them. And then as soon as he did that, what happened? They would start getting conquered and they would start going through all of these bad things, these curses. So I believe this is the manner in which Jesus Christ is saying, this is not a statement of salvation, losing salvation, but rather the life of a believer. If you're going to have this unforgiving heart towards others after God, forgave you, and you have the audacity to be unforgiving, then, God is going to, at some point in time, he could turn his face from you or remove his hand of grace from you and start, allowing you to go through more things than you normally would, I would say. And if we look in the Bible talks about God chastised those he loved. For if he didn't, we would be considered bastards, and a bastard is a father's child. So I believe that that is like a disciplinary means that God does to say, okay, well, you want to do your own thing. Let me allow you to do that and see how you kind of fare. And then one other point I want to add, the Apostle Paul talks about Satan, a person being given over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that their spirit can be saved. Now, people who talk about being able to lose salvation, well, Paul is sitting here and saying how a person can be, given over to Satan's attack for essentially to be killed, so that their spirit can be saved. So, I don't know how far out a believer has to go in order for that to happen, but apparently it can get to that point. But the reason I bring that up is just to show that you can't lose salvation, because if you can go as far as to say, you know what, this believer is so far gone, he or she is doing what they want to do, I'm going to just go ahead and call them home. I'm going to let Satan have reign over that person and take them out. He can very well do that. And we've actually seen God command devils and Satan himself. We've seen God give permission to Satan to go attack Job. He said you can do everything you want except kill him. And we've seen that Job went through great things, and Satan killed his family that was around him. So and if God gave her permission, he could have killed Job if he said you can even kill him if you want. But it's no far stretch to believe that Satan can't a person can't be given over to the attacks if God kind of removes his grace, and that person might end up losing his life. So we've also seen God send a unclean spirit to the Apostle Paul to torment him, to buffet him. We've seen that. We've seen God send an unclean spirit to King Saul. We've seen that in the Old Testament. So God can use even unclean spirits. He can use Satan even if he's so purpose to accomplish his will, in whatever situation that is. So, the very fact that a person can be given over to Satan so their flesh can die, but then their spirit can be saved, just shows you to the further extent to say that God will not lose one. He would rather just take you out of this life, call you home, than for you to just to continually sin in whatever degree God considers, okay, it's time to take you home. But, it doesn't say anything about losing salvation. That to me, that's like the furthest point to say, okay, I'm gonna just remove my hand of grace and let Satan just take you over and just have his way with you in your life, and just eventually you may die physically, but your spirit is saved. You're still saved. So, essentially, I just wanted to just look at this and just show that um, I believe this is more so about a believer going through a more hard life that they would, under normal circumstances, if they were obedient, wouldn't have to go through. So, and like I said, he's talking about who's the greatest in the kingdom. That was what he was responding to. And there is no torment in the kingdom. So those who are more obedient will be more greater in the kingdom. Those who are less obedient will be the least or less greater in the kingdom. But the fact is, they're still in the kingdom. So I just wanted to make this video. I pray God got the glory, and I pray this edifies whoever this comes in contact with. So until next time, I love you all, and God bless.